Welcome back, and today we're finally going to take a look at the last part of the exposure triangle, which is aperture. And aperture, guess what? It's the most complicated thing for people to understand. They basically flip-flop the numbers, and we'll get into why that happens. So what does aperture do? We learned that ISO controls the sensitivity of the sensor, also called ISO. We learned that shutter speed controls motion in the camera by how fast or slow the shutter opens. And aperture is actually inside the lens, and it's like an iris, like your eye, and it can open and it can close. So if it's open, it lets more light in. If it's closed, it lets less light in. But more importantly, it controls what we call depth of field. So if you see me as the field, what do we see in front of and behind me that seems to be in focus? So if anybody's ever used a phone now and you have portrait mode, essentially all it's doing is using a depth mask to blur the background, so you have a shallower depth of field. However, if you're shooting landscapes, a lot of times you want everything in focus. So you shoot with what we call a wide depth of field. So aperture works like this. It is written in a series of numbers that we call f-stop. So f-stop, all right? And the numbering system is very complicated for people to learn. And so it goes from 1.0 to about 32, though most lenses don't go to 32, they only go to 22, and most lenses that you're going to buy as an amateur start at f4 and go up. And pro lenses can go from something like a Noctilux, which is a 1.0, which almost nobody in the world is going to have, up. The cutoff number that we're going to look at is what we call f2.8. So f2.8 is what we call a fast lens, meaning it lets a lot of light in. An f4 lens, which lets a little bit less light in, is what we call a slow lens. So anything that has an aperture or an f-stop above 2.8 is slow. Anything below is fast. So I'm going to walk you through the whole stop f numbers for a basic lens. So we're going to go ahead and start off at that f2.8. Then it's going to be f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22, and maybe f32. Now, just like everything else before in digital cameras, there's third of stop numbers. So there's other numbers in between that. We're not going to learn those because they make it much too complicated. So the numbering system already, we can see we've got like a 2.8 and we got a 5.6, and then we've got normal numbers like 8, 11, 16. And yeah, it can be complicated for people to understand. So how does this work? So the small number, the f2.8, is the largest opening. So that's letting in the most amount of light. And that's where people get confused. The small number is the largest opening and lets in the most amount of light. And the largest number is the smallest opening and lets in the least amount of light. So it's almost like you're dyslexic and you flip-flop these numbers back and forth, and that gets confusing to people when they start learning photography. With aperture, just like with shutter speed and ISO, we've learned that they all control the amount of light. And so I just explained it. So that small number is a large opening and lets in a lot of light. And the high number, f22, is the smallest opening and lets in the least amount of light. So it's controlling the amount of light. But I just told you a few minutes ago that it also controls depth of field. f2.8 is going to give you the shallowest depth of field, meaning everything in front or back of me is most likely going to be out of focus. And the largest depth of field, f22, f32, where there's a greater chance for things to be in focus in front of and behind me, is what we call a wide depth of field. Now, the trick with this is aperture is not the only factor that controls depth of field, but for today, we're not going to pay attention to those other two factors, which are focal length and distance to subject. We're just going to assume it's only aperture, and that's what controls depth of field. In lenses, we have two different types of lenses. We have zoom lenses and prime lens. So a prime lens has a focal length that is fixed. So a 200 millimeter, and that's all it is. A zoom lens could be 28 to 200 millimeters and everything in between. Now, when you buy a lens, one of the factors that contributes to the price and the quality of the lens is the aperture. Is the aperture fixed, or is it a variable aperture? So what does that mean? So if I have a 24 to 70 lens and it's an f4 to 5.6, that means at 28 millimeters, the maximum opening is going to be f4. It's going to let in more light. But as you zoom to 70, it decreases and the max opening is now going to be 5.6. So the problem with that is you're basically losing a stop of light as you zoom, and you need to compensate for that loss of light in your exposure so you get the correct exposure when you take a photo. Now, a zoom lens with a fixed aperture, the aperture is the same the whole way through. So all lenses I own that are zooms are always going to be a fixed length because, yeah, that variable aperture is way too complicated to figure out and think about. So let's take that same 24 to 70 lens, and if I have a fixed 2.8 lens at 28 millimeters, my max opening is f2.8, and at 70, my max opening is f2.8. So when you're buying lenses, there's a lot of different factors that go into buying lenses. And let me tell you, one of the best things that you can do as a photographer is buy the best lens that you can, because optically it's going to give you superior images. Now, a lot of people think, oh, this fancier lens is sharper than the cheaper lens. Well, if it's not sharp, it's out of focus. That's not what we're looking at. What you see in more expensive lenses is more contrast. The contrast in the lens, or the ability to hold a wider tonal range, gives the appearance of sharpness, but it's really just contrast in that lens. What are some factors that go into the price of a lens? Well, the first one is going to be your optics. Low dispersion or nice dense glass. That's going to give you better contrast and better optics in your photography. The next one is going to be, is it a variable or is it a fixed f-stop? So obviously the fixed f-stop is more likely to cost you more money. Then what is your minimum aperture? So the lower the number. So an f2.8 85 millimeter lens, and if you had an 85 millimeter lens with an f1.2, that 1.2 is probably going to cost double or triple the amount of the 2.8. So that's going to be a factor in the cost. And a lot of lenses actually have internal motors, and those internal motors focus the camera. We have image stabilization in lenses, and those are your basic factors, what you're looking at when you're buying a lens and what's going to increase that cost. And they make a huge difference. Back when we shot film cameras, the camera just kind of opened and closed. It really didn't do that much. So you were much better off spending money on your lenses than you were on your camera body. We've learned a little bit about fixed aperture lenses and variable aperture lenses, and it's something that you really need to pay attention to, because when you buy that kit lens, that 18 to 55, that's a variable aperture lens, and it's going to affect your exposure as you zoom in and out on your camera. And the last thing I'd like to mention here, and this really doesn't have anything to do with learning aperture, but all lenses have what we call a minimum focusing distance. So usually the longer the focal length, the zoom in your lens, the further away from your subject you need to be. So for instance, let's say we have a 50 millimeter lens. Our minimum focusing distance might be 10 inches. So if I'm at 8 inches, I'm never going to achieve sharp focus because I'm too close. If I have a 200 millimeter lens, I might need to be 2 or 3 feet away from my subject, because my minimum focusing distance is either 2 or 3 feet. So you always need to make sure that you know the minimum focusing distance on your lenses, because you can't get too close or the camera won't be able to achieve focus. Well, that's the basics of aperture or f-stop when using the exposure triangle. So my suggestion to you is go ahead and play around with it. So a really, really good experiment, something that I have students do, is to take a picture with a really low aperture like f4, all right, and then try to adjust your camera to a high aperture like f11, f16, and get the same exposure. And what that's going to teach us is what we're going to cover in the next video, and that has to do with what we call equivalent exposures. Well, that's it for this video. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. Don't forget to subscribe and have an absolutely wonderful day.